Hello and welcome, folks, to the My Black Diabetes Meal Plan podcast. I'm Dr. Sean Smith, and today I am joined once again by world-renowned physician, Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Our goal on this podcast is very simple. What we want to do is get the facts clear on type 2 diabetes so that living with it becomes completely optional. And to that end, Dr. Fuhrman, I want to make sure I, one, welcome you, and then two, ask, before we jump in today, how was the holiday? How was the festivities for December?
Oh, I had so much fun with my family. I had a great time. First, we went to Sedona. We went climbing in the mountains in Sedona. We've been hiking, and I put a backpack on my dog, and he carried the water. And he's a 7-month-old Beauceron, so he was great climbing the mountains, even when you had to do the real steeps. I was afraid he would have trouble. She would have trouble. So we climbed mountains. We played games, and we made so we had a good time through the holiday break, and on Christmas we played word games, and we had a lot of fun. Just a lot of fun.
Any TikTok dances we should know about?
Okay. All right. I don't think I'll have permission to show those. Yeah, my wife and my daughters sent over some dance. I wasn't with my two daughters. One daughter was in Texas, one daughter was in San Diego, and I was in New Jersey with my son and my wife and other family. And so they sent us dances each. So we sent, and I was separate. Let's say I came back here. Anyway, so we all did crazy dances and sent them to each other. It was kind of funny, but some of them are a little too, I wouldn't want to show them to the public.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. Well, listen, folks, when the doc talks about this, he talks about climbing. He talks about doing activities with his family. He talks about creating memories, but the memories that can only be created when you have the health to support it. Right. And so one of the things I really wanted to talk about today was some of the misconceptions I'm seeing right now about body fat in particular, and then dietary fat on the back end of the podcast. And one of the things that I'm seeing, let me just pull this up for you because this is interesting. So just a sort of a quick lesson about what's happening in academia. Black identity is a term that comes from Black studies. It's about uplifting Blackness in the Black body. Now watch this. Fat, F-A-T, fat identity is a term that comes from fat studies. It's about uplifting fatness in the fat body. These scholars believe that fatness is as important to a group of people as Blackness, right? Because our very definitions of healthiness are made up by our culture, right? The Romans would have had a different definition of health than the Greeks, and the Greeks maybe than the Egyptians more so than the Americans, right? You can see how that works. There is no one objective true definition of health according to this body of work. In fact, there are a lot of ways to be healthy, and being fat is one of them. Therefore, fatness can be remade, reclaimed in a positive way so that people won't suffer from negative self-perceptions about being overweight. My question is twofold. What do these people seem to have right? And in your opinion, what might they be missing about being overweight and about having fat on the body?
Well, obviously it's a very dangerous movement to associate those two things together, Black identity with fat identity. I mean, that's like smoking cigarette identity or cocaine addiction identity. When you're overweight, you're a food addict, and you have a 7 times increased risk of infectious death from any, not even from COVID, from when you're even 30 pounds overweight. There's no such thing as a healthy overweight person. They're all pre-diabetic. The idea that if you can have good numbers, good cholesterol, good blood pressure, and good blood glucose, and that makes you a healthy overweight person, that's a complete fallacy. Fat cells spew out pro-inflammatory compounds, and they increase insulin resistance, and they suppress immune function, and they put you increased risk of death. So that message, and the problem is because food is so addicting, and everybody's a food addict, that these addicts want to rationalize why they don't have to give up their food addiction. And they want to rationalize why because the Americans are eating probably double the calories they need You know, I always say half of what we eat feeds our needs and the other half feeds the needs of our doctor.
Mm.
You know, we're eating wrongly and we're eating excessively, and we're food addicts, and we become food addicts by the processed food movement. And we're no overweight humans in human history. This is something, a new adaptation to processed foods and oils, and obviously that never occurred before in human history. And there are overweight animals in the woods. And if you're accepting overweight as something that you want to accept and not try to change, then you're accepting a shorter lifespan, a higher risk of cancer, and a higher risk of dementia and depression and heart disease and strokes. So then you're destined yourself to a more tragic life. I'm all for respecting people's individuality, and we should not be judging people based on their medical issues, their addictions, or how they look. And we should treat everybody with kindness and love and care and try to help them. But that's not the same thing as justifying it that you're so-called healthy at any weight. You're not healthy at any weight. You're unhealthy when you're above your ideal weight. And your unhealthiness is proportional to the degree of pounds that you've put on above your ideal weight. You're only a little bit unhealthy when you're 10 pounds overweight, but you're double that unhealthy when you're 20 pounds overweight, and you're quadruple that unhealthy when you're 40 pounds overweight. And that translates into shorter lifespan. The reason why they can justify this with some science is because 89% of people in America have a BMI above 23. That means that only 11% of the population is of normal weight. So most people are overweight. Now, okay, so let's look at that 11% that's a normal weight, because if you're eating like other Americans eat, you become unhealthy. You're cancer prone, you're heart attack prone, and you're pre-diabetic or diabetic. And keep in mind, this movement of fat is okay has resulted in 50% of our population now being pre-diabetic or diabetic. 50%. You're doing this goodwill for humanity, trying to help people reverse diabetes, but it's not a small segment of the population you're addressing. Half the population are either pre-diabetic or diabetic. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying right now is that we have all these people that are sick, and then we have the people that are a normal weight. And most of those people are sickly individuals who smoke cigarettes or have medical issues, or they're alcoholics, or they just have digestive disorders or occult cancers or depression. In other words, there's usually, if we compare the people that have a normal weight to people that are moderately overweight, it looks like being moderately overweight is not a risk factor, because their health isn't worse than people who are of a normal weight, unless you drive down that 11% to the 2.4% of Americans that are a normal weight because they eat healthfully and exercise regularly. That's only 2.4% of Americans. When we compare that 2.4% who achieved a normal weight due to good health and not due to smoking cigarettes or being unhealthy, then you see a dramatic difference in disease and longevity and risk of and illnesses. But when you take the normal weight people as a whole, we're looking at a population of sick people that if they were healthy, they'd become overweight like everybody else because not eating a healthy diet. So we can distort statistics. The Atkins camp, driving a high protein diet, they used to use the same thing and twist statistics in the same way. They would, for example, take an Asian study where in some Asian countries, they're eating like 5,000 milligrams of sodium today and have huge amounts of hemorrhagic strokes. They have 10 times the risk of hemorrhagic stroke, where you bleed in the brain, compared to the ischemic strokes we see in this country. And they'd say that giving these people more meat reduces the risk of stroke, which it did, because when you have more atherosclerosis and more fat on the inside and outside of the blood vessels, that are thus likely to rupture and cause a hemorrhage when you take in so much salt, and because salt causes microvascular hemorrhaging and weakens the endothelial lining of blood vessels over time. And the high salt diet gives you such a high risk of hemorrhaging that eating more meat and cheese and high cholesterol is protective against a hemorrhage. But it also increases risk of embolic strokes, but in those populations, their risk of, stroke incidence overall went down with more meat intake. Whereas in this country, where we have a different type of stroke, we mostly have the embolic and ischemic strokes and heart attacks which are caused by clots. Then eating more meat and cheese and high cholesterol raising foods increases risk of death, because we don't consume 5,000 milligrams of sodium a day. But in any case, the idea is to cut the sodium out, not to give them meat to protect against hemorrhage. And the idea here is to cut the meat out, not, so the whole thing is people just confuse the issues because they want to trick people, because they have their agendas, they have their biases, and they want to come up with some reason why they can convince people to follow their, their philosophical agenda,
Right, right. And I'm hearing you say two things in terms of what folks are getting right from the fat studies camp is, hey, look, it's okay. We want you to love yourself, right? There's no reason that anyone should be disrespecting somebody because they are dealing with an addiction. That is 100% certain we're in alignment on. But the difference, the issue happens when you say that fatness is is not like a disease, that fatness is not, doesn't have any health consequences to it.
Correct.
It has health consequences to it. And in order to be responsible, we have to be able to address and talk about the health consequences of being overweight. And in order to give people the tools to properly address it, we need to make sure that we're being honest about what it is and what it isn't. And to that end, I'm wondering as I'm listening to this, is there a tacit assumption here that body fat comes from predetermined genes rather than an earned habit that comes from eating the wrong foods, right? In other words, what do people need to know to get the facts right about body fat in this case when it comes to the fat studies camp?
That's a good question, because there are some genetic influences on metabolic and storage of body fat. And for example, take the Pima Indians and that we're talking about some people whose historically they were slim, very active people, and they ran 20 miles, they ran long distances, they lived on a diet with cactus root and berries and nuts and whatever it is, they were all super healthy, long-lived people. And then they ate the American diet, which didn't fit their genes and their historical, and they all became overweight, and the whole population of this Indian area all became diabetic. They're like almost a 98% diabetic. They had no diabetic in their ancestry. What I'm saying right now, though, is that you might be a little more prone to another person to put more weight on and become diabetic, but that doesn't mean you're destined to that if you eat healthfully. It's only if you don't eat healthfully that those negative genes would have a chance to be expressed. And one of the most exciting things in modern nutritional science is this concept of gene silencing. Gene silencing means that your negative genes get silenced when you eat the green vegetables and enough of these onions and mushrooms and greens that are able to protect the genetic defects or genetic weaknesses. But the other issue,
well, can you say more about that? That's you call this thing gene silencing. If I'm hearing this correctly, it sounds like if I eat enough of the appropriate foods, then negative genes or genes that would otherwise have a negative effect on my body get turned off.
That's exactly correct. And we were talking about the BRCA1 gene, the GSTP1 gene, increasing risk of breast cancer, that the body has the mechanism through the NRF2 transcription proteins. It's called the ARE, the antioxidant response elements turned on by the NRF2 transcription proteins, that the body has the ability to either turn off or on genes and to help the cells stay healthy and to repair damaged genes as well. So, we were saying a hot new area of research is gene silencing, where the body has the ability to recognize genes that are abnormal or not in your best interest and to shut them off. And gene silencing is only enhanced or activated when you have good immune function and good exposure to the ITCs, the isothiocyanates in green vegetables, are the most powerful substances. The constellation of nutrients found in green vegetables enables gene silencing, and high green vegetable intake has the most powerful association with reduction of cancers of all types, and of course of longevity. But the other point that's very important to mention here is that throughout human history, people died and lived shorter lifespans because they couldn't find enough calories and couldn't find enough food to eat. Starvation was the main cause of human issues and problems, not excess calories. genetics over the decades and millions of years selected out with a genetic lifespan advantage for people who could get by on less calories and have slower metabolic rates. And because your metabolic rate is the rate at which you're aging, that means if you have a tendency to become overweight easier on less calories, that means that that's a genetic advantage, because now this person would have survived areas of famine and food scarcity in past generations. And not only would have they survived, they would have thrived because they're aging slower. When they're at a normal weight, consuming less calories, their slower metabolic rate means they're aging slower. That person now thrust and placed in the modern era, where we have excess calories and empty calories, becomes overweight and they die young. But if you have that person eat a diet that's designed for them so they maintain a normal weight, that's the person who will live past 100 years old and be the longest lived person. I'm saying that the overweight person, the pre-diabetic or even early diabetic person, because they're overweight, would have been the person who had the longest lifespan possible had they ate a diet of our ancestors that were better adapted to the human species. There were no Black diabetics 200 years ago. You know, they were super healthy people. And after the Civil War, when Black Americans were growing their own food in vegetable gardens, they had the most centenarians, the most long-lived people in America. This is not a genetic weakness. If anything, it's a genetic advantage if you eat healthfully. It only becomes a weakness when you put processed foods and fast food and junk food. That's the enemy. That's you could say, the scourge of trying to kill people, is all these fake foods that are addictive, that we've developed, that food scientists developed to make them addicted, to get people hooked on them. So we've hooked people on drugs and we've hooked people on addictive food, and then we blame the individual now, right?
Right.
And in medical schools they say, oh well, you know, these people are something genetically weak about, their disease prone. No, they're not. And I'm saying, well, it's not disease prone at all. It's just they're not adapted for this diet. If you take a panda bear and you feed it, you know, beefsteaks, they're going to die. Then they're not designed for that kind of food. If you eat the food you're designed to eat, you could have great health, and there's no genetic weakness in being overweight. It's maybe even a genetic advantage if you eat the right food for your body type and your genetics.
Perfect. And right now there are actually popular methods called intuitive eating. I don't know if this kind of thing is circulating, if you're getting this information in your world, but if you're on Instagram, right, there's these big movements for intuitive eating, and what these folks want to do is deprioritize fat loss and allow people to eat what they want when they want, because then people can simply notice how their bodies are feeling as when they're eating quality foods versus traditional foods. And as rational beings, people will choose the healthier options because, oh, you know,
not going to work.
Oh,
can't work.
Okay. Are there any red flags to this approach when it comes to?
Because we don't have food. We're not surrounded by food. We're surrounded by the drugs. These foods are drugs. They're not real food. A person can't control their desire for cocaine, intuitively eat the amount of cocaine they want, because sugar and honey and maple syrup and white flour, the major source of calories in America is white flour products, and that's a drug. That's not a food. It doesn't contain nutrients humans need for survival. Sure, if they're shipwrecked on a desert island, you know, okay, and they with natural foods, they can eat natural vegetation and some salamanders and catch some small animals or some seafood and eat mostly, and they can eat intuitively if they're only choosing from natural foods that grow wild on the island. But once you put oils and processed foods and sweets and flours and all things that are drugs, not food, in there, that's just a ridiculous concept then. So yeah, we're trying to get people intuitively, but keep their boundaries on healthy choices, eating intuitively I eat as much food as I want. I'm not trying as much food as I feel comfortable eating, but that's because my body instinctually wants the right amount of calories, because I'm picking my choices from real food and from healthy food that have fiber and bulk and nutrients and texture and take a lot of chewing muscle to chew a long time. A gorilla eats as much as they want, and or a chimpanzee, they eat whatever they want. They don't overeat. They stop eating when they had enough. And we would stop eating if we had enough, if we were eating natural foods, but we can't do that when we have all these fake foods that are man-made, processed junk, and even the animal products that we're eating that are commercially made are processed junk. They're not like natural animal products. They're higher in fat.
You-
And we wouldn't be eating wildebeest and giraffes and zebras. We'd be eating salamanders and snakes and frogs and some small seafood we could catch. But the point is, our animal product intake would be relatively low, and our plant material would be very high. A primitive diet would have 75 to 100 grams of fiber a day. We're talking about, we'd be eating even the fruits of yesteryear were less sweet and more fibrous. And you wouldn't, even a pineapple today isn't like the pineapple you'd find in the woods 300 years ago.
Wow.
They're bred to be sweeter and have less fiber in them. And so so go out and go into the jungle and eat some wild blueberries and wild artichokes and we do it all the time. We go in with these experts and we go in the woods and the forests and we try to look for food. And there's an amazing amount you could eat out there. There's an amazing amount of food you can eat out there. But it takes time it's hard to, you can't get that much at once. It takes a long time to pick those little tiny berries and to shake the tree down and get the little pine nuts to fall. It's very hard to get enough food. You can get good food and you can eat instinctually when you get, and even when an animal eats instinctually, like a primate, they don't sit at a banana tree and eat bananas all day. They eat a few bananas and they go to they travel 2 miles to go to a different food tree. They go for variety in their diet, and they eat greens and shoots and take a long time peeling the shoot down and getting in any case, we're trying to get people to eat instinctually because they're eating so healthfully. They're back in touch with the real amount of calories the body's desiring is the right amount now. But once you put in unhealthy, addictive, fake foods, you've discombobulated your instinctual desires and you can't eat instinctually anymore.
Right. Okay. So in other words, intuitive eating, you like the idea. In fact, that's where you want to move people to. The difference is that you have no real avenue for intuitive eating when the food choices aren't even real food. It's processed material from the store. And so it's like, well, intuitively, do I want Lucky Charms or Fruit Loops? Well, the reality is that neither of them are good for you. And so we throw that out. Let's reset. Let's get you clear on the foods that make sense. And then, yes, you'll be able to choose between what's natural for you and what isn't. And so I think that's a beautiful assessment of what needs to happen. You've also talked about how someone with type 2 diabetes is actually addicted. And once you say addicted to the wrong foods, now we are bringing in there's a psychological component to this. In other words, if you are type 2 and trying to go onto the intuitive eating method, it's possible that your judgment is compromised, right? That what your intuitive system has been hijacked in such a way that you'll naturally gravitate to the foods that are poisonous, just like the Coke addict will naturally gravitate to the drugs that aren't good.
Not only possible, it's a certainty. I would say it's a certainty that they're going to gravitate towards foods that are unhealthy for them, because that's where the foods have been designed to hijack your brain and to make you want them. They do the bliss point. They give you enough caloric density that's absorbed very rapidly that stimulates dopamine centers in the brain. The food's been designed by scientists to get you hooked to those foods. Right. So the instinctual of eating means addictive eating if you're using foods that have been, modern foods, because don't forget, in the the most protective, longevity promoting foods still are vegetables, and vegetables, beans, mushrooms, and onions, and nut are still the basis of a healthy diet. And Americans eat 2% of calories from vegetables, 2%. Other primates eat like 60% vegetables or 70% vegetables. We eat 2% in this country. And that means that's all vegetables, not even green vegetables. And a high intake of green vegetables is not optional. A high intake of green vegetables is essential for humans, for normalcy and immune function, and normalcy of function of the heart with, in the brain. And in other words, there's no such thing as there's some luck involved and there's some occasional exceptions, but essentially, you need healthy foods to be really healthy.
Right. And there's the final question that I want to ask. Really, it's a link between body fat, which is what we have been talking about, and dietary fat. One of the misconceptions, of course, is that if I eat a whole bunch of dietary fat, then I'll get more body fat. In fact, most people think that if they can pinch some fat on their bellies and thighs, then that must mean that they're eating enough fat in their diet. You say you've seen people with thinning hair, dry skin, muscle cramps, poor sleep, poor exercise tolerance, who do not realize that their real problem is fat deficiency. So this is interesting. We're going from talking about how to get rid of body fat to saying, okay, well, we want to eat more fat. A part of this almost seems like they're at odds, that there's a tension, but there is not a tension. What does it mean to be fat deficient, and how do we know when we are experiencing it? How do we specifically correct it?
Well, caloric density does play a role in your weight too. Eating foods that have a high volume and are naturally low in calories, you can eat larger volumes of them and not get fat. The American diet is way too high in fat, and they're eating fats that are omega-6 fat, predominantly vegetable and grain oils and soybean oil, and they're eating, which is 1,000-fold olive oil. They're eating oils which are calorically dense, and the high caloric density rush does produce body fat. We still don't want to take all the nuts and seeds out of our diet. We want to use a judicious amount, maybe a half an ounce with each meal, to facilitate the absorption of the phytochemicals. We need some fat in the meal to get maximum absorption of the antioxidants and phytochemicals and nutrients from the meal that have the most powerful anti-cancer effects. And also the other issue with fat, we want to have a good omega-6, omega-3 ratio to reduces inflammation in the body and reduces cancer risk and promotes longevity. And so if we eat too much fat, we push, especially omega-6 fats, we push up the omega-6, and when you have more body fat on your body, you can't have a good omega-3, omega-6 ratio, because your body, there's so much omega-6 body fat that if you're taking fish oil and taking omega-3s, you have all that body fat, it's keeping the ratio of omega-6 too high. Until you drop some body fat, you can get the omega-3 fatty balance above 5%. So it's a complicated question. Maybe we're not going to have enough time to go into in depth, but yes, most people are eating too much fat, but mostly they're eating the wrong type of fat.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. I get all my fat in my diet from nuts and seeds, and a little bit that's in vegetables, and in beans. But most of my fat comes from the judicious use of nuts and seeds with the meals, with the sauces, or an avocado. I'm eating whole natural foods to get the fat, not processed foods, which then get you hooked, addicted, and drive up your appestat to overeat calories.
That's right. And folks, stick with your nuts, your seeds, in order to get your fat content. If you'd like to get more information on how to eat well for people who are dealing with type 2 diabetes, go to myblackdiabetesmealplan.com. Keep in mind that every person that comes on board is also going to get Dr. Fuhrman's T20 meal plan attached with their package. Dr. Fuhrman, I thank you so much for joining today. I'm going to say have a blessed and wonderful morning, and we'll talk soon.
Good. Best of health, everybody. Happy holidays.